Chapter 9, Hope for the World. The Brotherhood's arrival within the city walls wasn't marked by fanfare. No parades. No public speeches. Just the slow, deliberate creak of armored boots on concrete, and the unmistakable feeling of gears turning inside Lancaster's machine. They came in quietly. But they came in for good. Elias Ward, now fully embedded in Lancaster's command council as a liaison, didn't waste time. Within days of gaining limited access, he handpicked a recon technical detail, 2 scribes, 1 senior paladin, and a logistics officer, and began combing through every inch of the tech Lancaster had gathered, built, or kludged into working order. They weren't disappointed. The solar fission hybrid reactor powering half the city? Crude, but stable. The reclaimed tanks and power armor stations from Fort Pioneer? Low efficiency but tactically brilliant. The makeshift printing press, the water grid, even the thermal air ducts welded from hollowed-out train pipe. It all worked. And it all screamed the same thing. We don't have schematics. But we have blood and willpower. After 2 weeks, Elias called it what it was. A frontier miracle. The idea began to form. Quiet at first. Whispers among scribes and engineers. But it took root. We could restart the Brotherhood here. A new chapter. Not bound to the Appalachian wreckage. Not tangled in the old wars. Something smaller. Smarter. More integrated. Lancaster could be the forge. But while Elias was looking outward, others were looking inward. In the vault archives beneath the mill, in a room reinforced with scrap steel and guarded night and day, Scribe Helena and Dr. Keene sat over a table covered in medical files, radiation charts, fungal culture growths, and FEV maps. In the center of it all, a profile mark, subject 717 alpha/alias, Johnny Vanjik. Helena tapped a column on her tablet. He spent over a decade exposed to concentrated spores, background radiation spikes, and direct FEV aerosol interaction. Keene nodded, adjusting his cracked bifocals. And somehow, his cells didn't just survive. They adapted. Mitochondrial clusters show signs of reactive memory encoding. His metabolism rewrote itself. He doesn't need caloric energy the same way we do. And neurologically, his theta wave patterns are irregular. Active during sleep and conscious states. He's seeing things we can't. Helena leaned in, whispering like she was afraid Johnny might hear through the walls. Do you think he's a latent telepath? Keene shook his head. No. Something worse. He's an evolutionary fork. Not quite human. Not quite mutant. Not feral. He's a version of what happens when the world ends, and someone refuses to die anyway. They sent word through official channels. They wanted to examine him. Not harm. Not contain. Understand. Not just because Johnny had survived, but because somewhere deep down, they feared what might come if someone like Johnny ever stopped surviving. Permission was requested. The meeting was scheduled. And for the first time since the fall of Vault 717, Johnny was about to be looked at not as a leader, but as a living mystery. The room was sterile in theory, not in practice. Sheets of clean aluminum hung loosely over scorched walls. Brotherhood equipment hummed softly beside Lancaster-engineered interfaces, a hybrid diagnostic station that worked only because someone had once welded desperation to genius. A single spotlight buzzed overhead, flickering every 30 seconds, just enough to keep the room from feeling safe. Johnny sat in a repurposed metal chair, not strapped, not sedated. He wasn't angry. He wasn't smiling either. Across from him, scribed Helena, late 40s, gray at the edges of her braid, eyes like a machine that never powered down, and Dr. Keene, the last living specialist from Lancaster's original med team, his lab coat scorched, cracked glasses held together with solder and willpower. They weren't afraid of Johnny, but they weren't pretending he was ordinary. Not anymore. Helena tapped her data pad once, glancing at him only briefly before speaking. "We appreciate you agreeing to this, Johnny. I know you don't like being poked at." Johnny didn't look up. "Long as no one brings out a scalpel, we're good." Keene gave a small, nervous chuckle, but Helena kept her voice even. "We're not here to dissect. We're here to understand." She swiped the pad, pulled up a screen with blurred logs and corrupted images from Vault 717's surface archive. "Truth is, we didn't get much out of the vault when it was sealed." Johnny finally looked at her, his gaze cool, detached. "No. You didn't. I killed the staff. Most of them didn't even scream. Others earned their slow end. The rest? The residents. They ran blind. Grabbed anything they could carry. Most didn't know what they were even holding." He leaned back slightly, arms folded. "You're not getting back down there. The place is locked and buried. The earth doesn't want it open again, and neither do I." Helena nodded, almost respectfully. "Understood. But we pieced together fragments, records, psychological reports, test logs, partial outlines of something called Project Luminary. The dark section was designed to be purely nocturnal. No artificial light beyond low-spectrum UV. Bioluminescent fungi. Spore saturation. Designed to simulate deep cave conditions, but engineered." Keene cut in, his voice lower. "The long-term goal wasn't just isolation. It was directed evolution. The children placed in that section weren't just test subjects. They were intended to form a hive mind connected through FEV-altered neurological pathways, aided by airborne spores and ambient radiation." He paused. "It should have worked. We think it did on the others. But not you. Johnny's jaw tightened. His fingers twitched once on his leg. Helena studied him for a moment before continuing. Something about your DNA prevented the hive mind from forming around you. You should have become the central node, the alpha. But instead, the spore network rejected you. Or tried to, and failed. You didn't link. You didn't dissolve into the network like the others did. You stayed, you. Johnny's voice was low, nearly flat. I felt it. Like a pressure in my skull. Every night. Trying to pull me in. Trying to tell me I wasn't alone. It got louder when the others started to change. When they began to forget who they were. He looked up now. His eyes had that faint glow again. That green-white shimmer like cold fire in a glass jar. I resisted. And I kept resisting. Keen leaned forward, his voice quieter now. But that's the part we don't understand, Johnny. It wasn't just resistance. It wasn't just luck or willpower. It's your biology. Something was already off before the vault ever touched you. He tapped a readout on his terminal. Genomic overlays. Blurry sequences with red error lines and green anomalies stacked against pre-war baselines. We've looked at your gene markers. There are irregularities. Clusters of mutations that don't follow radiation patterns. And they're not FEV signatures either. Helena spoke now, slowly. Johnny, from what we can tell. She hesitated. Then said it. You were already mutant before you stepped into that vault. The silence after that was thick. Johnny didn't answer immediately. He let that hang in the air like rot. Then, slowly. My parents were normal. City folk. Lived 3 blocks from the loom mill. Nothing special. They weren't sick. Weren't exposed. I was born during the panic. The sirens. He tilted his head slightly. But even then, I knew something was different. When I got sick, I got better fast. When I got hurt, it never lasted. I could see things other kids didn't. In shadows. In corners. My dreams felt like memories I hadn't lived yet. Helena whispered to Keen, too quiet for Johnny to hear. Neurological precursor traits. Epigenetic instability. Maybe he was a second generation something. Keen looked pale. If that's true, we may not be looking at the result of Vault 717. We might be looking at its trigger. Johnny stood up then, slow, deliberate. I didn't come here to find out what I am. But if you dig deep enough and figure it out. He looked them both in the eye. Just promise me you'll do something useful with it. Not for me. For Lancaster. And then, without waiting for clearance, he stepped through the door, coat dragging across the steel floor like a specter returning to his haunt. The door hissed shut behind him. Helena sat in silence. Keen looked at the data again. And both understood, truly for the first time. Johnny wasn't a result. He was a catalyst. The lights buzzed overhead. One of the consoles sparked briefly low voltage feedback, nothing critical, but no one in the lab moved. Because Keen was holding his breath. And Helena's hands were shaking just slightly. As she stared at the genetic render laid out on the cracked projector wall like a prophecy that had just been decrypted. "This doesn't make sense," Helena muttered, swiping through overlapping sequences, faded base pair chains, and annotated protein structures, each one more warped than the last. "I reconstructed the original genome based on vault immunization records and baseline childhood scans. It's crude, but functional. Everything looks human. But then you look at what's in his DNA now and something's wrong." She expanded 2 profiles. One labeled, Bradley.717.pre-war. The other, Vanjik.active post-war. Keen leaned in, squinting at the breakdowns. The effects of Project Luminary, the specific neurosynaptic lattice, the memory splicing potential, the metabolic core dampeners. They were already there. Before the vault. Before the spores. Before FEV exposure. He backed away from the screen like it was about to explode. Helena blinked hard, mouth half open. "That doesn't track. We have records Vault 717's staff picked these kids randomly. Age, location, parental clearance. All within the standard Vault Tech guidelines. The other children had normal gene patterns. They didn't start mutating until they were exposed to the spores and the high push protocol. But Johnny..." She shook her head. "No. Bradley. His genome was like kindling. The project didn't build the fire, it lit it." Keen was already pulling open the city's digitized municipal archive. Old world documents. Civic records. Immunization reports. Dozens of files pulled from ruins during the earliest years after the exodus from 717. There has to be something. A mention. A clinical note. A flagged report. Anything showing pre-vault experimentation. His fingers stuttered over the keyboard. "Come on, come on." Helena was pacing now. Even Vault Tech couldn't predict this kind of mutation. Not to this degree. This kind of outcome is directed. Something primed him for this. Keen stopped typing. The room was quiet. And then... Wait. No. No. Wait, look closer. He expanded a file buried 3 subdirectories deep. Old World DSHR 1124/rad clearance A5. An encryption tag sat at the top. Then a red stamped header. Confidential, federal oversight clearance required, Project Daedalus, do not file. Helena's breath caught. That's not Vault Tech. Keen nodded, slowly. No. That's DOD. Department of Defense. The file opened. And inside, blurred schematics. References to genetic markers. Not names. Just clusters. Subject, AE717 Alpha. Status, unstable, non-deployable. Location, redacted. Notes. Subject displays latent anomaly, neurological resistance to cognitive link conditioning. No hive integration. Memory interference null. Suggest continued environmental suppression. Genetic potential significant. Risk of spontaneous evolution if exposed to compound catalysts. Keen read the next line out loud, barely above a whisper. Consider indirect observation only. Recommend civilian cover placement. Helena stepped back like she'd been struck. They didn't find Johnny. They planted him. What if the vault wasn't about testing a new mutation, she said, almost dazed. What if it was about recreating something they'd already seen? She looked at Keen, voice shaky, stunned. What if Project Luminary was never an original idea? What if the old world found something like Johnny, and spent years trying to make another one? Keen stared at the screen. You're saying... He swallowed. You're saying the government knew about whatever Vanjik is. Before the bombs. Before the vaults. And they were trying to copy it? The room was dead silent now. Because that wasn't just theory anymore. That was motive. That was origin. Johnny's not just a survivor, Helena said slowly. He might be the blueprint they were chasing. The reason they started the war machines. The trigger they tried to re-engineer. And far above them, standing on the western wall, Johnny Vanjik stared out at the horizon. Where blackbirds circled far-off mountains. And something old, buried deeper than memory, was starting to wake up. The sun was setting hard over the ridge, bleeding burnt orange through shattered skylines and smoke-withered trees. Lancaster stood quiet behind them, distant fires, the low churn of filtration pumps, the murmurs of children in bunkhouse windows. Johnny Vanjik stood on the western wall, coat heavy with dust and ash, boots planted like anchors. His glowing eyes scanned the horizon like they always did, half expecting something unholy to come crawling out of it. And for a moment, just a moment, he almost laughed. Not a full laugh. Just a dry, half-breathed chuckle, like someone who finally realized the joke was on them all along. Those poor doctors. He said it without turning. They're not gonna make any better heads or tails out of this than I have. Behind him, Milo leaned against the rusted rail, arms folded, his own ghoul eyes narrowed from years of seeing too much and surviving more. He tilted his head slightly. Like how you know things you shouldn't. Johnny blinked once. Turned. A slow grin crept over his face, not amused, just surprised. Someone finally said it out loud. Huh. You noticed that? Milo shrugged. You get this look sometimes. Like you're remembering something you haven't done yet. Johnny sighed and looked out again, hands resting against the railing, metal warm under his fingertips. Look. I can't explain it either. I'm convinced more than half of it is bullshit. I got no way of knowing what was from me, and what was from the Hive's propaganda feed. He paused. The air shifted around him quiet, like the wind was listening too. But I saw something, Milo. Other me's. And I'm not talking mutants. Not evolutions. I mean literally other versions of me. Different scars. Different voices. One of them had metal in his chest. Another wore a coat made of bones. One lived in a tower made of glass and radiation. Milo didn't speak. Not out of disbelief, but out of respect. Because deep down, part of him had always known there was something different about Johnny. Something beyond Vault 717. Something that wasn't supposed to be alive anymore, let alone walking around and running a city. Johnny shook his head, laughing softly now, bitter. Call me crazy, but it's like I'm linked to some sort of knowledge pool. Not tech-based. Not AI. Not networked. Biological. Like the Hive carved a door open in me and forgot to close it. He turned and looked Milo in the eye. I'm not sure if it's some side effect, or if it's something else entirely. They stood there in silence. Wind whispering through cracked girders and rifle slots. And finally Johnny exhaled, straightened up, and reached for the old binoculars on the nearby perch. But I'm not concerned about all that. We've got farms to build. Roads to clear. Raiders sniffing at our borders and a county still bleeding out. He slung the binoculars over his shoulder and turned to descend the wall steps. Whatever the hell I am. He looked over his shoulder one last time. Eyes glowing like bottled lightning. It's not more important than them. And then he was gone down the ladder, leaving Milo to stare after him and wonder whether Johnny Vanjik was a man shaped by war, or if war was something that had simply borrowed his shape. Milo stayed up there a while longer, arms crossed tight over his chest, eyes sweeping the tree line as Johnny disappeared below. He didn't speak. Didn't move. Just let the cold settle in around his old bones and let the silence soak into the rust. Something about what Johnny had said dug deep, not like fear. Not even awe. More like a crack in something he thought was solid. Not just the man. The myth. The way Johnny spoke, like the universe was just a half-forgotten conversation happening behind his eyes. Like every war he fought wasn't just survival, but remembrance. Milo spit off the side of the wall. Other versions of him. He shook his head. God help this world if one Johnny wasn't enough. Dash. Down below, in the heart of the mill, Johnny moved through the industrial corridors like a phantom. He nodded at familiar faces: traders, engineers, welders with soot-streaked smiles. Everywhere he went, people stepped aside. Not in fear. Not in worship. In recognition. He wasn't their mayor. Not their general. He was the reason they still had streets to walk. He stepped into the map room, once a boiler room, now the nucleus of Lancaster's planning grid. Dozens of maps spread over walls. Civic layouts, resource flow, known hostile zones, recon sketches from scouts out as far as Mountville and Millersville. A few guards nodded to him. A courier handed him a report, sightings of new raider movement near Old Route 30. He scanned it, nodded, folded it once, and tucked it into his coat. Double patrols out west. If they make it over the bridge, I want the tanks ready to roll within the hour. The guards nodded. Already moving. As Johnny turned to leave, he paused in front of the wall-size county map, faded, burned in spots, covered in red string and metal tacks. His fingers touched one spot gently. Vault 717. Burned out. Buried. But never gone. He whispered to himself. You couldn't turn me into your weapon. So I became something else. He exited the war room and walked toward the foundry yard. Passing by the Brotherhood techs who were now beginning to integrate into the city structure, hauling salvaged steel, rewiring generators, teaching ghouls and scavvers alike how to maintain higher tech circuits. Elias saw him. Nodded from across the yard. Johnny raised a hand back. Not a salute. Just a shared look between two men who fought for futures they didn't belong to. Later that night, in the dark quiet above the mill housing stacks, Johnny sat alone on the rooftop. He didn't sleep. He rarely needed to. He just stared at the stars, those distant, indifferent fires overhead, and thought about what the doctors said. Other versions. Not dreams. Not visions. Memories. From places he'd never been. From bodies that didn't quite fit his own. From selves that lived through different apocalypses. One had died screaming in a snowy forest. Another stood on a mountain of glass and neon. One sat in a vault far darker than 717, whispering to himself, forever alone. And he wondered, were they real? Were they him? Or was he just the first one who clawed his way out of the dark with a name still intact? A voice came behind him. Helena. We ran more simulations. Johnny didn't turn. Find anything useful. She walked forward slowly. No. Just more questions. More contradictions. You're a paradox wrapped in trauma and survival instinct. He finally turned to look at her. Yeah, welcome to the club. She sat beside him, quietly. The stars above crackled with cold fire. You know we'll never fully understand you, right? Johnny nodded. Doesn't matter. Just make sure this place survives longer than I do. Dash. Helena looked at him for a long moment. We'll try. Johnny stood. Brushed the dust off his coat. Don't try. He started down the ladder. Do. And as he disappeared below, Lancaster's wind carried with it a name not whispered in fear or awe, but with the quiet certainty of something eternal. Johnny Vangeck. The man who rose out of the dark and refused to stop walking.